Let's get into our interview, David.
Yes, well, Jennifer is the filmmaker of a film called This Child of Mine, which documents 3 families that were affected because they refused to follow the mainstream paradigms, the mainstream dogmas on HIV and AIDS. And perhaps, Jennifer, we could start by you describing a little bit about the Emerson case, which I think is the oldest of the 3 cases, who Valerie Emerson was and how she was affected by HIV.
Okay. Hi, guys, and thank you for letting me talk about this today. So Valerie Emerson found out she was HIV positive. Her name is actually not Valerie Emerson anymore. I think she's since remarried, but at the time, she had recently separated or divorced from another husband, and he showed up at her doorstep. I believe he had been abusive to her. It had been a really terrible relationship, and she was a single mother now of 3 children and pregnant with her 4th. And he showed up at her doorstep one day to collect some things that he left at her house, and as he was leaving, he said, "Oh, and by the way, I just tested positive for HIV. You should probably get tested. You probably have it too," and walked out the door. And so that sort of started Valerie's nightmare, and she, of course, she said herself she was worried that she had HIV, but she was much, much more worried about her children. So she tested, and she had her children tested. She tested positive, and 2 of her 3 children also tested positive, Tia and Nicholas. And she was, like I said, she was pregnant with her 4th child. So she started on drugs to prevent mother-to-child transmission. I think at the time the only thing available, this was back in 1997, or no, actually it was before that. So probably just AZT was the only thing available.
It still is.
It still is. Okay, so not much has changed.
No.
And she, immediately started having side effects from that. She was very concerned about that. She told me that something started showing up on the sonogram of her son's, on her son's sonogram, some mass or something she couldn't understand, and she stopped taking AZT, and those things sort of went away. Her daughter Tia was immediately prescribed AZT. Now Tia, Valerie describes Tia as having always, since the day she was born, she had been a very sickly child. She had had all kinds of respiratory problems and asthma. And so when she started on the AZT, her health did begin to decline. But Valerie, she was concerned about it, but she didn't think too much about it because, Tia was sick to begin with. So she kind of just went along with this. And Tia's health steadily declined to the point where she couldn't get out of bed, she couldn't eat. Valerie remembered that the only thing she would drink was a little chocolate quick. That was the only thing that she could keep down. She had to be carried everywhere. She was in constant pain. I mean, it was, as a parent, it was, I'm sure, torture watching this happen to your child and know there's just nothing that you can do to stop it. Tia died 9 months after starting AZT, and this was about several days, I think, before her 4th birthday.
About what year was this we're talking about?
I think this is 1996.
Yeah, I think that would be about the time based on my recollection of the case.
Right, because then, so right after that, she looking back years later, she felt that a lot of what Tia suffered was directly related to the AZT, but of course she could never know for sure because she had been so sick to begin with. Now, the doctor also recommended that Nicholas, her other child that had tested positive, start on AZT. Now, Nicholas was a little bit different because at this time he was asymptomatic. He really hadn't had any signs of illness. He was, Valerie described him as a boy who loved to run and play. He was fine until he went on the AZT. He started getting sicker and sicker. And her pediatrician, who also appears in the film, will corroborate all of this. She said, there was certainly no improvement in his health due to the AZT, and there was, vast decline in his health. I mean, he started down the same road that Tia had shortly before her death. So Valerie stopped his AZT, and she didn't get too much flack for that. But a short time after that, her pediatrician heard about a clinical trial that was going on for, a very popular treatment at the time, HAART, which I think is highly aggressive antiretroviral treatment.
Highly active.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think at that time it was only approved for adults, but this was a clinical trial for children. So it had been tested, but it hadn't been tested in children. And she wanted to send Nicholas to the specialist to see if he would be a good candidate for the trial. So, Valerie was very concerned, of course, after what she had gone through with Tia and Nicholas, but she agreed to meet with the specialist. So she went to meet with the specialist, and, naturally she had a lot of important questions. What are the side effects going to be? Is he going to get sick the way he did on the AZT, the way Tia got sick on the AZT? What are the long-term effects? I mean, questions that really any parent would want answers to, especially given her previous experience.
Let me interrupt here. Now, we're talking about a child with no illnesses, correct?
At this point, he really hadn't shown any signs of illness except when he was on the AZT.
Just a clinical marker that he had tested positive for these proteins.
Correct.
On the HIV test.
Correct.
He was put on drugs without being sick.
Right. Now, her pediatrician tells a slightly different story, and I mean, it's really slightly because, she said he had some developmental delays. He had he had occasional respiratory problems, but, these are very non-specific, lots of children have developmental delays. I mean, she wasn't necessarily saying that was attributable to AIDS, or HIV, but, other specialists would say, clearly he had HIV and he needs to be on these drugs right away.
Every single thing that you become ill from once you get an HIV positive test can start being ascribed to the mysterious HIV by these medical practitioners.
Exactly. But, Valerie, she didn't know anything about this issue before it hit home. She lived in an extremely rural part of Maine in a trailer. She didn't, she wasn't educated. She had her own instinct and she had her own experience, and, this was she was concerned, as any parent would be concerned. So she went and she asked these questions of a specialist, and they parted for some time. She was going to decide whether or not she wanted to do it, although I think she was leaning towards not doing it because she didn't get any conclusive answers from the specialist. And the specialist was going to decide whether or not Nicholas was a good candidate. Well, before she ever got any response from the specialist, I just want to point out, again, this was not her primary care pediatrician. This was an HIV specialist. She got a knock on her door from Department of Human Services, DHS, and basically the specialist, had turned her in for being negligent. He accused her of being argumentative, and this is also according to her lawyer, who later represented her in the hearing that followed. She being accused of being negligent. The main concern was that she was not psychologically able to make this decision because of the trauma she had suffered. She was not able. Basically, she couldn't see clearly what was going on. She wasn't able to make this decision because of what had happened before, and so she wasn't an objective. Well, of course, she wasn't objective. She had real experience behind her.
Right.
So she ended up going to court. And initially, they just wanted to force the treatment. They just wanted to say, the state's position was, he needs to be on these drugs. He's sick. He's going to die if he doesn't get the drugs. And they just wanted to force treatment. But when they realized that Valerie was not going to, agree to this, they came away from that point of view and decided instead that they wanted to remove Nicholas from his home so that he would be guaranteed to get the treatment. Because, of course, at that time, maybe less so than today, the treatment was very hard to administer. I mean, it was like you had to stick to the routine. It had to be given many times a day. Apparently it tasted horrible. It was very hard to give to children. And you had to have somebody who was a willing participant as a parent. And Valerie was clearly not going to be that person. So the state moved to remove Nicholas from the home. What was interesting in that case was, in addition to all of the witnesses that, Valerie brought in a number of people to testify on her behalf, experts. The state brought in a number of experts. But their most interesting expert was this doctor out of Harvard University, Dr. McIntosh, who I guess was this world-renowned HIV pediatric doctor. And, the state had brought him in, to testify about how important it was that Nicholas be on these medications and, to make their case, essentially. Well, what he ended up doing was saying all of those things. He did say all those things, but he also said, in as much as I think that the child needs to be on the medication, I don't think it's appropriate to remove him from the home because you're not going to have any benefit from that. You're going to, the psychological trauma of that is going to be just as devastating as anything else. I mean, if it's not right in the parent's heart, then it really shouldn't be forced. It really has to be agreed upon by the parent or parents. And so I don't believe that removing custody would be a good idea. And I think, her lawyer and she both believe, and it may even be in the judge's statement, I don't remember exactly, but that was one of the most, that was one of the turning points for the hearing, was this doctor's belief that he shouldn't be removed from the home, and therefore you had to sort of work with the parent, or work with Valerie. And then interestingly, after that, the doctor agreed to see Valerie for free and treat Nicholas if down the line she decided she wanted to go in that direction, and in the meantime just be a consultant. And so she maintained a relationship with that doctor for a number of years. What was really interesting about Valerie's case is she kind of had two faces there. She had to put on the face, at the trial. She said, yes, of course, if he goes on to develop symptoms, I will comply. If the state, she said to me later, if the state had said that I had to do it, yes, I would have done it. That's what she said in public. But the truth of the matter was, and I believe she told David Rasnick and a number of other people, that her bags had been packed for several weeks. That if the state had decided that Nicholas had to be on the drugs, or if they were going to take custody of him, she would have taken him and her family, and she would have fled. And I think, for me, that part of the story came up, or that part of the issue came up over and over again. Was this idea of pushing families out of the system. When you back people into corners, you don't get the resolution that you want. You end up with families who are just opting out altogether. And so luckily that didn't happen.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, I just looked up the judge's statement. It was 1997 in January when Tia died, and it was September 1998 when the judge ruled in favor of Valerie Emerson and said that she did not have to give the drugs to Nicholas.
Another thing that I just want to quickly say, which is really fascinating, and David, you can kind of do some fact-checking for me on this because you may know off the top of your head better, but what I found really interesting about this was that I want to say 6 months later, certainly a year later, after this trial, after this hearing ended, the guidelines changed again. And they were kind of pulling back from this treat early, treat hard mantra that they had been pushing for the past few years because they were finding, for all kinds of reasons, the drugs on a long term. Nicholas was 4 years old when he would have started these drugs long term every day. What is that going to do to, the side effects over a course of a lifetime, however long that life would be horribly debilitating. And they were also talking about resistance of the medications, or resistance of the virus to the medications. So they started really pulling back and saying, maybe it's better we wait for patients or for people to develop symptoms before we start with these, aggressive treatments. So really, if her case had come up 6 months or a year later, in the view of the doctor, she would have been making all of the right decisions.
Right. That's true. It was around 2000 or 2001 where they changed a lot of the guidelines, but it wasn't necessarily that people were sick. They were basing everything on the CD4 count. So Nicholas could have been perfectly healthy, but if his CD4 count had been 200, they would have gone to court to put him on the drugs, even without any symptoms. But this story did not have a happy ending because Nicholas died in 2006.
He died in 2006. He was 10 years old. Over the course of the next few years, his health fluctuated. He had years where he was doing really well, and I will say I wasn't in touch with Valerie, on a day-to-day basis, but I would call her. We would talk every so often, and I know that he had some respiratory problems. I know I think he went through at least 2 episodes of meningitis, where the doctors basically both times when she brought him into the hospital, they said he's not going to make it through the night, and he ended up back in his home a few days later. She did begin treatment for him probably around 2003 or 2004. I don't remember exactly when, but she started him on some antiretrovirals. And then, but she still felt that his health was she's still, I mean, there's a part in the movie which is so sad where she says, I feel like he's going to have a good life and he'll graduate high school and he'll go on and have a life. And then he died very soon after that. So, the doctor said it was AIDS-related lymphoma, and Valerie said, it could have been AIDS-related lymphoma, or it could have just been lymphoma. Lymphoma runs in my family. A lot of the side effects of these drugs have been linked to all kinds of cancers and lymphomas. So, again, it was sort of one of those gray areas. But, he died at 10 years old in 2006.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a study that showed that, I'm doing this from memory, but non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, there was something like a 50% chance that somebody who took AZT would get non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after about 3 years or something. So it's quite plausible that the ARVs, the AZT he was exposed to, and then the later ARVs were what caused him to get cancer.
Right.
The medical term here, by the way, or the term for these kinds of diseases produced by doctors are iatrogenic illnesses, illnesses that are induced by chemicals.
Well, maybe we should go on to the second story, which has a happier ending, which is the story of the Tysons. Or at least I'll put it second. I'm not sure if that's quite the chronological order, but perhaps you can give us a brief summary of that story as well.
Yeah, the Tyson story was the one that I started with. Because when I first decided to make the documentary, I had gone to Christine Majori, who was she wasn't a friend of mine at the time, but we had spoken, we knew each other, and her husband Robin actually was how I met Christine. He was a friend of mine, and I told her, I want to make a movie about this dissident point of view. I've never heard anything about it. I don't know anything about it. It's I don't know how much of it I agree with or don't agree with, or if I'm in any kind of position to have an opinion, so I don't really have any medical authority, but it's certainly interesting. And she said, well, this is really a side of the story that you should focus on because nobody's looking at this side of it, and it's a little bit more interesting to sort of everyday America than just, another AIDS news article. And she pulled out an article about the Tysons who lived in Eugene, Oregon. And so Kathleen Tyson and David Tyson had been together for about 10 years at this point. In a monogamous relationship. They had a 10-year-old daughter who, by the way, Kathleen had breastfed for 3 years. They were total salt of the earth couple. I mean, they lived in a rural part of, or they lived in Oregon in the small city of Eugene. They ate organic. They were the healthiest people you'd ever meet. And during a routine battery or series of tests, during prenatal, when she was 7 months pregnant, she tested positive for HIV. Again, so far outside of any traditional risk group, it just, came out of left field for them. Obviously devastating, shocking. Nobody could figure out where she might have picked up HIV. I mean, she had never used any kind of intravenous drugs. She'd been in this monogamous relationship. Both her daughter Faye and her husband David immediately went out and got tested, and they both tested negative. So it was a mystery. They, of course, immediately said, you need to start on the AZT, and she, of course, just without any time to process anything, said, yes, of course, doctor, I'll do anything. But she began to feel sick, and she began to feel fatigued, and naturally she began to really worry about the effects of AZT on her child growing inside of her. I mean, one of my favorite lines from the documentary is when she says, I was counseled not to take aspirin, and here I was being prescribed these incredibly toxic drugs, and what was that going to do to my baby?
Well, to segue on that, AZT, I think most people know this, but it is an analog for one of the 4 components of DNA, so it directly interferes with cell division, which, of course, if you're pregnant, is interfering with the growth of the baby. And aspirin doesn't do anything like that, and yet, like she said, aspirin's not recommended. You're not supposed to drink wine, but it's okay to take something that interferes with DNA synthesis. It's just incredible.
And of course, they were told it's a what's the term, risk-benefit ratio. Which is the greater risk, taking the AZT or contracting HIV? And so, But nevertheless, I mean, and she and David actually did a lot of their own research. I think they found Christine Majori. They found Heal, Portland, I think they got a lot of information from. They decided, you know, she didn't want to take it anymore. She stopped it very soon after she started it, and of course all of her symptoms went away, and she went on to have a healthy baby boy, I believe in December of 1999. And nobody gave her any trouble for that. You know, they didn't agree with her, but they didn't really cause too much of a ruckus about it. And it wasn't until she was in the hospital, and again, they tried to give her AZT during the delivery of her child, and she refused that, and they were like, all right, that's okay. And then when she was in the hospital, she said two things that got her into trouble. Number one, I don't want to give my baby AZT because the normal course of treatment would be after the child was born, at least at that time, and maybe still now. They get a 6-week course of AZT. And they're also not allowed to, parents, of course, the mother doesn't breastfeed the child because she could theoretically transmit the virus through breastfeeding. So Kathleen said, I don't want to treat him with the 6 weeks of AZT, and we've chosen to breastfeed him. And the nurse didn't even know what to do with that. The nurse apparently freaked out. She went and spoke to the attorneys for the hospital, and, I mean, within hours, there was a petitioner from the Eugene court, the local court down there. There were 2 armed security guards outside of her door. She called her husband in a total panic. And I also want to point out, by the way, she had had a C-section, because that's another recommendation for women who are delivering when they're HIV positive. So she had a C-section, so she had been on painkillers, and so she's very foggy, and she's just had a child, and all of this comes down at her at once. Within 4 days, the state of Oregon had removed legal custody of Felix Tyson. He was allowed to remain in the home, but all medical decisions from here on out would be made by the state of Oregon, and they had people coming into the house and watching her as she would give him a shot of the AZT, checking his poops apparently to make sure that she wasn't breastfeeding. All of these really invasive things that were going on, not to mention the fact you have a stranger coming into your house, unannounced whenever he feels like it.
And it's kind of ruined the bliss of being a new mom.
Kind of. A little bit, I would say. And again, I mean, not that this affects anybody, should be worse for any one person more than another, but if you met this family, I mean, they had their first child in a home birth. They had breastfed, she had breastfed Faye for 3 years. They were, these were not people who were used to, like, loads and loads of medical intervention. So this was just upsetting on all different levels. So they went to court. There was a hearing for them, and at this point, by the time the court hearing came up, the AZT issue had basically passed because the 6 weeks had gone by. It was sort of moot. So at this point, the focus of the hearing really was on whether or not she could breastfeed her child, and she had been, I believe she had been storing her milk or whatever in the hopes that she would eventually be able to feed him breast milk and continue breastfeeding, but that didn't happen in that case. They were found to, they weren't found to be incompetent. The state did retain legal custody, but Felix was able to stay in the home. She was not allowed. She was told she couldn't breastfeed, and I believe that order was lifted about 2 years later, where legal custody of Felix went back to the parents. And, I mean, honestly, since then, I don't think it's affected their lives at all. I visited them in 2005. Still, Kathleen had never had any signs of illness. I saw her again in 2008. Still, I mean, I looked that healthy. And she's a little bit older than me, and she looks like she could run a marathon. I think she does run marathons.
Yeah, I know that she was a runner, so incredibly healthy. And so if she was 10 years in, 99, we're now talking over 20 years that
right.
She's been HIV positive without any symptoms.
Right. And, I mean, the thing is, I know there's a lot of talk about cross-reactions, and this, to me, truly was a case where, I think she had she told me she had had hepatitis, some form of hepatitis when she was traveling as a college student. She had been traveling in South America somewhere, and I think she'd had hepatitis. She'd had a number of, conditions or, infections that might have caused a cross-reaction. She did test repeatedly for a little while, and she continued to test positive, but after a while she said she's like, I just don't want to give the test manufacturers my money anymore. You know, it doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my kids. My kids are fine. I'm fine. And, you know, we have our kids, and we're healthy and we're happy. So it's just sort of irrelevant in my life, and it continues to be, I think.
I think at this point maybe we should, just for listeners, particularly for new listeners, it's a test about nothing. It's a test about proteins that are supposed to be specific to antibodies that come from this viral code written in nucleic acid wrapped in some protein. There are 70 different, more than that, bodily conditions that can produce these blood proteins. It's not a test for a pathogenic virus. That's why the whole, you fall into this AIDS trap when you agree to, or when you assent to, without your permission, the HIV test, and the routine HIV test produces these kinds of results that we're talking about right now.
Right, and it's unfortunate that for a pregnant woman it's very difficult to avoid. It's not mandatory in most places to have an HIV test before when you're pregnant, but it raises a level of suspicion that all of a sudden you're seen as non-compliant, you're seen as likely HIV positive, and it's likely that the state will react and try to take custody of the child just on the basis that you refuse to have an HIV test. It's kind of like refusing to have a breathalyzer.
And the reason why this is so important right now is that there are efforts all over the United States of America to get everybody tested. We're seeing more and more local jurisdictions just insisting that everybody get tested. So you're going to produce all kinds of situations like this in which everybody gets tested, and then you have these situations that we're talking about right now, and people fall into this AIDS trap and they fall into this drug trap.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, what seemed to happen. So people would say, people will ask me, why are parents being forced to do this? You can't force medication. And I said, well, you don't directly, it's not a direct link between you forcing to take the medication, but you can accuse somebody of being negligent, and, then accuse them of negligence, and then you lose custody that way. I mean, it's sort of this indirect way of getting people to do things that, they don't want to do. And, like the doctor in Valerie Emerson's case said, ultimately, if it's not right in the parent's heart, how much worse is it to take a child from their home? I mean, what kind of physical, psychological effects is that going to have on a child, especially a child that you are claiming is a sick child and needs all the support they can get, so...
It's crazy because, many cases, like with Nicholas, we're talking about a child who's perfectly healthy apart from this positive test. And yet there's many recent stories where child services have overlooked people who've been starving their children to death or beating them to death.
Yeah, I can never understand that either.
Yeah, it's like...
I mean, because you hear them say, well, there's too many cases, there's too many cases. Well, I don't know, there seem to be other cases where they could be focusing their energies, which are overt.
Yes, yeah, real harm. Children who are being overtly harmed. It's really quite crazy.
I have to interject just for a second. I mean, I also can see the other point of view. If you're a social service worker and you hear of this happening, the thing that was sort of struck me with all these cases is I never got the feeling. We talk about this divide between AIDS dissidents and the AIDS establishment, but the doctors and people I spoke to, with the exception of a very few, there was never this sense of like, you have to do what we tell you to do. There was this sort of concern for the child coming from two different places. And so, I mean, the best doctor, the best example of this was the doctor, Valerie Emerson's pediatrician, who said, I consider myself a guide in this process. I can't force her to do something that she doesn't feel comfortable doing. This is her child. And, any doctor who forces you to do something isn't really helping you along, isn't really, assisting you in getting better health. They're just forcing you into a corner. And that's not necessarily being a good doctor.
Well, I think Valerie Emerson kind of lucked out with her doctors being a little bit more open-minded. And you also
Oh, yeah.
mentioned the doctor from Harvard who believed in the drugs but didn't believe in taking the child away from the home. One thing I wanted to comment on the Tyson case is, I don't want to call it a mistake, but it was completely innocent. But when Kathleen Tyson told the staff that she was going to breastfeed and didn't want the AZT for her child, that was a mistake.
Right.
We now know it was a mistake. She should have said, sure, give me the
Right.
prescription. Of course I'm not going to breastfeed. And then gone home and done what she want, because if she left the hospital without raising suspicion, they wouldn't care what she did at home. But once you've raised the level of suspicion that you're not going to be compliant, then all hell breaks loose.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, to me, that's the biggest crime of all this, is that you have to, you make these decisions. I don't necessarily fall down on one side or the other. I'll be honest. I have a lot of questions about all of this from both perspectives. But the idea that you have to lie about your choices and you have to hide, when making these controversial decisions, that, I mean, for me, in making the movie, that was sort of the most interesting aspect of it. I couldn't say for sure now. I haven't done enough of the research. I'm not a doctor, and all of those disclaimers. But, there's things on both sides of this issue that make sense to me. But this idea that if you take one side, you're a criminal, or you're crazy, or you're in denial, or you need to hide, that to me, especially as a parent caring for a child, a parent who clearly loves that child, there's no question of that in any of these cases, that is the opposite of negligent. I mean, these parents did ridiculous amounts of research, more research than I think I would do myself. I mean, I feel like they were the exact opposite of negligent, and they were being accused of negligence. I mean, I understand the distinction between medical negligence, but that idea that you have to hide behind that decision, that you can't say that out loud and not get in trouble, to me was the scariest part of all of this whole issue.
Yeah, it truly is. We should go on to the third case that you document in your film, This Child of Mine, and that's the case of Christine Majori and her two children, although I think you mostly talk about Charlie, right, in the film?
Well, there's a whole section there when she gets visited by Child Protective Services, which I can talk about, and that was around Charlie. It was actually before Eliza Jane was born.
Right.
But Christine Majori, I started to say, I met her through her then future husband, Robin Scoville, who was a friend of mine. And I just remember him talking about how he was dating this woman, and she was amazing, and she was incredible, and, her name is Christine, and, oh, by the way, she has HIV, and she doesn't believe that HIV is the cause of AIDS. And I remember I kind of cocked my head and was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then pretty soon after that, Christine became pregnant with Robin's child, and again, she's not going to use any of the mother-to-child transmission preventative drugs. She intends to breastfeed. And at that point, I had this very strange reaction because I didn't have kids at the time, and I didn't know anything about this issue. But I remember being absolutely incensed, in shock, and having this very loud reaction, like not to Robin, but to another friend of ours. How, why would she do this? And she can think whatever she wants about her own body, but, how could she impose this on her child who's not even born yet? That's so unfair. I then went to meet Christine, or she came over for dinner one night, and I found her to be, I was expecting this complete nutcase, and I found her to be very reasonable, interesting, smart, funny, just not at all as I was expecting. And I became very interested in her point of view, again, without knowing a whole lot about it or having an opinion about it at this point, but thinking it was really interesting. So we talked some more, and, I told you I went on to, she kind of helped me with the writing the proposal for the documentary and giving me some ideas and really putting me in touch with some of the families that I met. I mean, you see three, including Christine in the movie, but there are several others that I met as well that don't appear. And she became sort of a consultant throughout it. Obviously, Christine's story is that she was diagnosed HIV positive in 1992, and she, in classic Christine form, became an activist. She spoke for AIDS Project Los Angeles. She started up a group herself for women with HIV. And she really sort of, she spoke about the mainstream points of view on HIV and AIDS. Don't have unprotected sex, use condoms, don't do drugs. She spoke at schools. I mean, she got very involved in this. And then she met a doctor who said she didn't fit the profile of a typical AIDS patient. And so she retested, and she tested negative. And then she tested again, and she tested positive. I mean, it kind of went back and forth. I think it tested indeterminate. She had viral load tests. Like, she would take a test on one day, and her count would be through the roof. She'd take it literally the next day, just as an experiment, and it would be back down to normal. So she had all of these crazy testing scenarios that went on in her own life. And then, she met Robin. She became pregnant, and this is a woman who at one time thought she wasn't even going to live long enough to have kids. She had Charlie, and they decided together, she and Robin, not to test Charlie and to just, live their lives. I mean, she was still obviously very involved in the AIDS dissident movement because she had done a lot of research and found out about all this other perspective on HIV. And they decided they weren't going to subject him to testing, and a lot of it was because she knew if he tests positive, the very next minute they're going to be telling me I have to put him on the drugs, and if I don't put him on the drugs, they're going to try to take him away from me. So they just stayed away from all of that. And she was pretty vocal about a lot of these things. I mean, she really didn't try to hide. Somebody turned her in when Charlie was about 3 years old made an anonymous phone call to Child Protective Services saying that she was breastfeeding her son Charlie. And you see in the movie a person from Child Protective Services comes over and interviews them, and it's a terrifying time in their lives. Christine and Robin came up with a plan to escape if they had to. It was literally like, we're going to jump the fence and, with a set of keys and a little bit of cash, and we're going to meet up at this location. And, I mean, it was like a renegade plan. Luckily, none of that happened. The person never came back again. The investigation was closed.
Well, I just wanted to ask, or to comment. One of the things when I watched the film that I felt was that I was sitting in the living room when these things were happening. Like, how did you happen to be in the living room at the time this woman stormed in the door from Child Protection Services?
Well, as a matter of fact, I was not there at that time. Robin filmed that. Robin was making a movie at the same time that I was making a movie, and you've seen that, I think, the other side of AIDS.
Right.
And he had some footage that I don't know why he chose not to use that. He sort of took a different tone, I guess, or, did a different type of movie. And he had all this footage, and he didn't want to use that footage, which I sort of found astounding. I thought it was really very, I mean, you literally are there in the living room and talking about it, and so, or watching it as it happens.
Yeah, so, well, I think it fits your movie a lot better than it would his, because he wasn't really talking so much about that issue, and maybe he didn't want to personalize it so much. So I guess it's a lucky stroke for you, because it is quite remarkable.
It was, because initially I was just going to have her talk about it, and then Robin kind of chimed in and said, well, I was filming that day. And, in classic Robin form, he actually asks if he can leave the camera running, and she says no, excuse me, and then he just kind of turns the camera, and so you actually have the whole thing recorded anyway.
Right.
And which to me is even a little bit more chilling, because you're just hearing these voices and kind of imagining what's happening in the room and what people are doing and how they're feeling. So that was obviously, for Christine, who had been working with so many of these families, she had been in touch with the Emersons, the Tysons, Sophie Broussard, just, as she says, dozens and dozens and dozens of families who had this happen to them, where, they were just going about their lives, and then this happened, and they made the wrong choices according to mainstream AIDS research, and they ended up losing custody of their kids or going to court. She had been involved in so many of these cases, and now it was happening to her. And she said, I'm seeing it now from a whole new light. And now kind of living with the specter of, people are going to be watching me now for the rest of my life until my kids are 18.
I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but boy, this just gets right to this question of this push that we've been seeing for the last 2 or 3 years for everybody to get tested, and how many more of these cases are we going to see when we spread this fear by spreading this testing, this epidemic of testing? That's what we have, of course, here, is an epidemic of HIV testing, not an epidemic of AIDS, not an epidemic of disease, but an epidemic of testing that ends up putting people into these positions.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's deliberately diabolical, but they always seem to manage to test.
It's deliberately diabolical because it's being pushed by the drug companies who want to get more customers. Frankly,
yes,
that's what it's all about.
But
the drug companies and the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, the local agencies, the nonprofits out there, there is this drum beating. You've got to get tested. You need to know your status. We're just pushing people
But they seem to
toward
pick
this
on
cliff.
they seem to pick on groups of people who are the most vulnerable, and a pregnant woman is very vulnerable. She's emotionally vulnerable because if you tell her she's doing something that will harm her child, most women will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid that. Like we had one friend that really enjoyed a glass of wine, and she didn't need to tell us she was pregnant because she'd come over and we'd offer her a glass of wine. She'd say no, and it's like, oh, you're pregnant, because she was going to be absolutely sure she wasn't going to drink wine at all during pregnancy. So if you tell somebody they have a fatal illness and this drug will stop you passing it to their child, the majority of women will take it, and even if it hurts them. Even if they feel sick, they will continue. Gay men are vulnerable. They're a shunned part of society.
Fear is a powerful weapon, and when you start equating sex with death, two of the things people think about.
Well, it's even more diabolical to equate
and children
the giving of life to death. That, to me, is turning black into white.
The psychological terrorism of this paradigm, the terrorism that it's caused among gay men, among black Africans, among African Americans, among pregnant mothers, it is just awesome.
Right, and this sense of you're a criminal if you do the wrong thing. And I mean, interestingly, I remember I spoke to this woman at an organization in LA called Women Alive, and it's an organization for women with HIV, and they have a lot of women there who are mothers, and this woman that I spoke to, who was a treatment advocate, she said, yeah, I have a child, he's been on the treatment for 18 months, and that was my choice, but I would never, ever say that I know for sure this is the right thing to do. She's like, I don't know if it's the right thing to do, I could be wrong, I know that. I'm taking a risk, but that's my risk to take, and no one should be forced to take that risk if they don't feel right about it. And, that is what I kept seeing again and again in these cases. And, what Christine really was, fighting against. I mean, among other things, but that was obviously with 2 kids of her own, that was a very central issue for her.
The really interesting thing here is that these clinicians who urge people to take these drugs, they can see with their own clinicians' eyes the results. They can see the, quote, side effects, unquotes, and they just dismiss them. It's as though, our thought process is so clear here. This is a retrovirus. It's going to kill you eventually. You have to take these drugs. They just can't see what the drugs are doing. They're blinded to it, literally blinded to it.
There was one article in, I think, Mothering magazine where they interviewed one of these pediatric AIDS treatment doctors, and she says, oh no, the drugs don't have any real side effects. She said, well, of course the children get cancers and things like that, but that's all due to HIV. Just immediately dismissed any side effects of the drugs, and as I said earlier, especially with AZT, this is a drug that interferes with DNA synthesis, which interferes with the growth of cells. How could that not cause problems with a fetus, especially as we know it goes across the placenta? One correction I wanted to make, I said earlier, they're still giving AZT to women. They are, but I don't think they're giving AZT alone to pregnant women, or maybe not as much. But my understanding is all the so-called cocktails that are given to mothers contain AZT. So it's still being given, but maybe not in the same dose it was given in the 1990s.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think it had been approved as a single therapy when everywhere else in the world it was, in every other group it was considered like medical malpractice because it was so debilitating and ineffective. But for some reason it stayed active as a useful drug in that particular group of people, pregnant women and infants.
Yeah,
and that persisted for a long time.
Yeah, it got through clinical trial, and nobody wanted to ask any questions about whether the clinical trial had any flaws. And once it was approved, that was it. And the only competition to AZT has been nevirapine, which is widely used in Third World, but it was withdrawn from approval in the United States. The drug company voluntarily withdrew it when there was a scandal in Uganda. That's a drug which has equally severe side effects to AZT, so it's not much of a choice.
Jennifer, I'm curious, what kind of response are you getting to your work, to the work you've done in this area? Are people? Do you get attacked?
Well, I don't get attacked because I don't feel that here's the thing. When I was making the movie, the movie that I've ended up making doesn't really come down strongly. I wasn't really trying to find the answers to some of these questions, such as, does HIV cause AIDS? I wasn't really trying to come down too hard on one side or the other, and it wasn't me just being wishy-washy or, to use the favorite documentary term, objective. For me, I was much more drawn to the issue of, parents being able to make decisions for themselves, or how, whether or not parents are allowed to make these types of decisions. I was much more interested in the personal story of each of these families. And so what I really did in the end, I have a lot of interviews with doctors, and I have a lot of interviews where there's a lot more back and forth about the tests and the treatments and that. But I realized in order to make that movie, I was going to have to cherry pick these like sound bites, to get all the factual information in there, and it was going to be a very different kind of movie. So I ended up cutting out most of the doctors, and really, not all of them, but most of them, and really tried to keep the story from the point of view of the families. And so in doing that, they're telling their story. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it. So no, I haven't been attacked yet. Maybe I will, I don't know. And again, I really wanted the focus to be on this issue of parents making decisions, and I think that is applicable to all different things, not just HIV and AIDS, but, certainly there are a lot of parents who withhold cancer treatments. There are parents who withhold vaccines. Not to say that they should do that or they shouldn't do that, but how free are we in our culture and in our society to do that? I would say the answer is not very, but here's what happens if you do. Here's the fallout.
And I think that makes your film quite unique because, there's a lot of films that kind of give a broad overview of the whole HIV/AIDS dogma, but yours focuses really on the emotional turmoil in families that go up against the system, and I think it makes it very unique and very different than any other documentary from Well, it's not even a dissident documentary. You're just documenting these families.
Really, that's true. And, I kind of came from this luxurious position of not having to take a side. Christine, in the end, I think that she, I know that she believed in everything that she was saying, but I think in a weird way she was also kind of forced to be on that one side and take it, because if you're going to stand up and say something controversial, you've got to be behind it 100%, and this is such a divisive issue. Now, I had the luxury of being able to come in and say, well, I'm making a documentary and I'm being objective, and I'm not going to tell you I don't know exactly what my point of view is on this specific issue. And I will say that honestly now. There are things that I do have questions about. The number one thing that people ask me right now when they see the movie is, well, what I didn't finish telling the story of Christine, of course, is that tragically her second child, Eliza Jane, died when she was 3 years old. And the coroner's report said that she died of AIDS-related pneumonia, and the family believed that she died of a reaction to amoxicillin. And people would ask me, well, what do you think? And I'd say, I honestly, I don't know. I don't know for sure. I talked to a lot of people about drug reactions and how that manifests. And I talk to people about, you know, the autopsy findings and, you know, does this look like PCP pneumonia, and tried to have those things explained to me. But again, in the end, I felt like no matter what she died of, the fact that Christine was so vilified afterwards, that she's not allowed to mourn her own child, that she has to constantly be defending herself, that, you know, on top of having this horrible trauma of losing your child, now you have this extra level of hell where where you're accused of killing that child or being responsible for her death in some way. And, you know, sort of watching her go through that process a little bit, which you see a little bit in the movie, although not too much. So I feel like I came from this, I sort of had this luxury of not really having to take too strong a stand on it, and that really wasn't the focus of the movie. I think a lot of the things that I learned from Christine are still true today. I mean, her main things, the testing is often inaccurate, and the epidemiology, the statistics that we see are often exaggerated. I mean, Christine's not the only person who said that. There's a lot of leading newspapers and sources that will tell you the same thing. But because Christine said it, somehow it's wrong because she's this crazy denialist, and so, you know, of course she's going to say that. I mean, there was so much truth to what she said, and those are the things that I really tried to focus on, like her.
And when people, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, that's it. Just, you know, just her again, like Christine obviously was very much in the forefront of, I guess you would call it, the politics of HIV research, but she was very personally involved in it as well. I mean, she was going through it with her own family, so I wanted to really focus on that as much as I could.
Yeah, I mean, after Christine herself died of, again, what was called AIDS-related pneumonia by the coroner, and what was considered an adverse reaction to an antibiotic by Dr. Al-Bayati, people would say, well, what about Christine? How do you explain this? But what the dogmatists never turn around and do is to go through cases like this, and they say, okay, well, with the Tysons, Kathleen Tysons being HIV positive for over 20 years, basically didn't take any drugs and is still perfectly healthy, had a child who I presume is HIV negative, or they would have had a lot of grief over that. Valerie Emerson took drugs only briefly, and she's retained her health, and the death of her children could easily be explained by them taking antiretroviral drugs. And even in the case of Christine, there's the question of why did she not transmit the virus to her husband? And what about Charlie?
Charlie?
Yes. So those questions never get asked. They always ask, you know, what did Christine die of? Which in a death like Christine's, where she was going through massive trauma for several years after the death of her own child, and all the like you said, the legal accusations that she was responsible for the death, and starting a lawsuit against the coroner, and all of those different things. There was a huge amount of stress in her life, but that's all brushed aside, and there's this simple answer: she died of AIDS.
And I can certainly attest to that, because I had dinner with Christine and Charlie about 5 weeks before Christine died. She was perfectly fine, but she was under incredible stress because of that horrible, I don't know what you call it, L.A. law. I always confuse these.
Law and Order.
Law and Order,
yes.
and
yeah.
the fictionalization of her life and her child. The very first thing she brought up when she got in the car when I drove them to this Japanese restaurant to have dinner, how can the media take away your life? I knew she was in trouble. I knew that she was suffering the psychogenic effects of being attacked as a denialist. Well, we're almost at the end of our hour, Jennifer and David.
Oh, that was fast.
Yes, it was. It was very good. And thank you very much for sharing this with us. We appreciate it. And we hope that our listeners will consider coming to Washington, D.C. December 1 through 3 for Rethinking AIDS 2011, when we're going to ask a lot of questions and give some answers. David?
Yeah, Jennifer, thanks very much. This interview was really good for me. I learned more about these really important cases. How would somebody go about getting your video?
Right now, it's available online at my blog /website, which is www.this-child-of-mine.blogspot.com. davidmcgee.com.
We'll put a link in the
that's
show
probably
notes.
a good idea.
I'll make sure it's to the right website, not to a porn site or something like that.
I would appreciate
Do one
that.
of those new fancy new quick read links, David.
What's that?
The new barcodes, they're quick read. They're called quick read links. You can just aim your smartphone at it, and you go right to the website.
Yes. So thank you very much. A very illuminating interview, and thank you for doing the film.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
Goodbye.
Okay,
We'll talk
goodbye.
to you soon. Bye.
Yes, goodbye.